When someone pushes away genuine love, they aren't just rejecting another human being. They're rejecting the very framework that could have held their fractured inner world together. And narcissists especially live under the illusion that they can simply walk away from the consequences of their behavior, that they can discard, belittle, and wear down someone who cared for them and somehow emerge untouched by the aftermath. But life does not function that way. Reality is built with a kind of moral gravity. And whether we acknowledge it or not, every action, every betrayal, every manipulation, every deception carries weight. Eventually, that weight begins to push back. The empath, the one who loved with depth, who gave without calculating, who stayed far longer than they should have, represents something extremely rare in this world, an anchor of authentic meaning. And when a narcissist throws that away in pursuit of ego, dominance, or fantasy, they don't just lose a person, they lose the mirror that reflected back their fragmented humanity, the one chance they had to face themselves and evolve into someone stronger, someone real. But life always circles back, not out of vengeance, but out of natural balance. And what the narcissist once overlooked, the love they believed could easily be replaced, returns not as comfort, but as consequence. The silence of the empath becomes louder than any argument. Their absence grows heavier than any presence. And the narcissist eventually stands alone, face to face with the damage they created, unable to blame, distract, or run anymore. That is the moment karma emerges, not as some supernatural punishment, but as the unavoidable reckoning that surfaces when truth finally insists on being seen. There comes a turning point in every emotionally lopsided dynamic, where the truth that was ignored or distorted for so long eventually reveals itself with absolute clarity. For the narcissist, this moment often arrives quietly, without the theatrics they once thrived on, without the chaos they used as camouflage, and without the endless emotional fuel they took from the empath who cared for them far beyond what was reasonable. It is a moment that drifts in like a shadow, slowly and inevitably, and its weight is heavier than anything they have ever faced. Up until this point, the narcissist lived with the belief that the love given to them was infinite, unconditional in the most harmful way, and easily replaced. They convinced themselves that affection, loyalty, forgiveness, and understanding were not gifts, but things they were entitled to. They misinterpreted the empath's compassion as weakness and their patience as permanent access. And so they threw that love away, assuming they could return whenever they wanted, certain the empath would always remain right where they left them. What the narcissist never grasped was that the love they discarded was not ordinary. It was a rare form of love, the kind that sees beyond the surface, the kind that invests with depth, the kind that stays even when staying hurts. Empaths don't love casually. They love with memory, with intuition, with soul. And that kind of love can transform a person if they're willing to let it. But the narcissist never allowed it because transformation requires vulnerability, accountability, and the courage to see oneself clearly. Instead, they chose control, manipulation, temporary validation, and emotional dominance. They use the empath's heart as a temporary shelter while giving nothing back except confusion and emptiness. And when the empath finally walks away, not in anger but in exhaustion, something irreversible begins. The narcissist doesn't notice it immediately. At first, they may even feel victorious. They may feel powerful, free, triumphant. believing they pushed away someone who threatened their illusions. They may dive into new distractions, new partners, new fantasies, convinced the cycle will continue just as it always has. But life slowly reveals the truth, peeling back their illusions layer by layer until all that is left is the raw reality they have spent years dodging. It starts with small realizations, subtle moments when they reach for validation and it no longer soothes them the way it used to. They begin comparing every new interaction to the empath's authenticity without realizing they're doing it. They notice how shallow other people's affection feels, how conditional, how empty. They start sensing a quiet hollowness that no amount of attention seems able to fill. And then comes the moment when the silence becomes overwhelming. The empath is no longer there to explain things gently, to support them during their spirals, to calm their storms, to absorb their anger, or to repair their cracked ego. The absence becomes a mirror reflecting everything they tried to hide: their dependency, their insecurity, their emotional void. What once seemed worthless now feels impossible to replace. What they dismissed as ordinary now appears extraordinary. The narcissist begins replaying memories, not because they care about the past, but because they feel the loss of the emotional anchor that once held their world steady. The very love they took for granted becomes the standard by which they measure every relationship, every interaction, every attempt to feel significant again, and none of it compares. They finally understand that the empath's love was a stabilizing force, a grounding presence, a source of emotional nourishment that cannot be replicated with charm, control, or new supply. They realized the love they abandoned was the closest thing to genuine connection they ever had. This realization cuts deeper than guilt or regret. It forces them to face the truth of who they are without the empath's emotional scaffolding. The narcissist begins to understand that what they lost wasn't just affection, but the chance to become someone capable of true connection. And in that moment, the weight of the love they threw away descends on them with a moral gravity they cannot escape, a gravity that feels like the universe reminding them of the one truth they never wanted to acknowledge: that real love is not replaceable, that the heart they mistreated was their lifeline, and that the absence of that heart is now the one thing they cannot outrun. There is a psychological shift that takes place when an empath finally steps away from the chaos that once held them captive. And this shift is far more impactful than the narcissist ever imagines. For so long, the narcissist functioned within a dynamic where they believed they were superior, empowered, and firmly in control. They assumed the empath's emotional availability was permanent, a fixed resource they could draw from whenever they felt insecure, restless, or empty. The empath was the stabilizing force, the one who softened their storms, interpreted their moods, forgave their outbursts, and created the emotional grounding the narcissist could never generate on their own. The narcissist believed this stability came from themselves, failing to see it was the empath quietly holding everything together. When the empath walks away, the narcissist suddenly loses the invisible support system they depended on. They may initially react with anger, denial, or arrogance, insisting the empath's absence is insignificant or temporary. But as time goes on, the silence grows louder and becomes a psychological environment they cannot navigate. They are forced to sit alone with the thoughts, insecurities, and emotional voids the empath once buffered. And for the first time, they experience their internal world without a filter. This is where the empath's absence becomes a weight the narcissist cannot dismiss. The empath wasn't just another person. They were the emotional interpreter, the one who understood what the narcissist could not verbalize, the one who sensed fear beneath anger, the one who recognized their need for reassurance even when they demanded control. Without that presence, the narcissist feels unsteady. Their emotions become erratic, their thoughts more chaotic, their sense of self destabilized. They attempt to regain control through familiar tactics, seeking validation, manipulating new people, exaggerating their charm. But these strategies lose effectiveness quickly. New supply doesn't understand their patterns, doesn't soothe their fears, doesn't offer the emotional reflection the empath once provided. The narcissist tries to suppress the discomfort, but the psyche forces unresolved truth to the surface. Slowly, they begin noticing a void that no amount of attention or superficial affection can fill. They might not call it loneliness at first. They might not understand what they're feeling, but they sense the loss of clarity and emotional safety they once had. Safety they never realized came from the empath. They become more irritable, more demanding, more desperate for external validation because the internal support they relied on has vanished. The empath's absence becomes a confrontation they cannot escape. It forces them to face the parts of themselves they always projected onto others. Their paranoia, their self-doubt, their fear of abandonment, their sense of inadequacy. These emotions were once diluted by the empath's patience and compassion. Without that buffer, the narcissist must face themselves directly, and it overwhelms them. As days turn into weeks, the narcissist revisits memories, not from sentiment, but from a subconscious desire to reconnect with the clarity the empath offered. They replay arguments, conversations, small interactions once forgotten, and they slowly see the pattern. It was the empath who made sense of things, who restored stability, who diffused tension. This realization is unsettling. It exposes the truth. They were far more dependent on the empath than they ever admitted. The empath's absence becomes a reflective surface, showing not only what they lost, but what they never built within themselves. And the harder they try to recreate that emotional environment elsewhere, the more they realize how rare and irreplaceable it was. This does not necessarily change them, but it forces them into an internal reckoning. The weight of the empath's absence becomes a force pressing against their psyche, stripping away illusions and leaving them face to face with their own emptiness, with no one left to absorb it. There is a pivotal moment in the narcissist's emotional unraveling where the illusion of their invincible persona begins to crumble. And this collapse happens when they must confront the vast emptiness they've been avoiding for years. For so long, they relied on external sources, attention, admiration, control, the emotional labor of others, and most importantly, the empath's unwavering presence to fill that void. The empath acted as the emotional cushion, absorbing every projection, every insecurity, every internal storm. But once the empath withdraws, once that steady flow of compassion disappears, the narcissist is left with something they never anticipated, the unfiltered truth of their emotional emptiness. This confrontation is gradual at first. They seek validation and feel less satisfied. They attempt control but feel less powerful. They pursue new supply, but the emotional high fades quickly. They try to recreate the sense of security they once had, but nothing works. That is because the empath wasn't just another figure in their life. They were the emotional regulator, stabilizing the narcissist's internal chaos. When that regulator is gone, pressure builds inside them. They cling to their defenses, grandiosity, blame, entitlement, but these begin to crack. Moments of anxiety surface, flashes of insecurity rise, emotional downturns appear without explanation. For the first time, the narcissist feels the true consequences of their emotional structure, or the lack of one. They spent their lives constructing a false self to hide their vulnerabilities, but without the empath reinforcing that illusion, the mask begins to fracture. Karma here is not mystical revenge. It is the natural outcome of being left alone with oneself after years of avoiding self-reflection. The narcissist never developed the internal tools for emotional regulation because they never had to. The empath did it for them. Now those fears return inward with intensity. Emotional spirals become sharper and harder to control. They may blame these feelings on the empath's departure, but the truth is deeper. These emotions were always inside them. They were simply concealed behind the empath's stabilizing presence. The narcissist begins feeling psychological constriction, a tightening caused by realizing they have no one left to absorb their emotional turmoil. They notice relationships feel shallow, life feels hollow, and interactions feel meaningless. The empath once provided warmth, depth, and significance even if unacknowledged. Without that warmth, a cold emptiness sets in. This isolation is the true karmic consequence. The narcissist eventually becomes aware of the void they cannot outrun. They attempt distractions, work, relationships, impulsive choices, but nothing fills the hollowness. They may even think about returning to the empath, not out of sincerity, but to escape themselves. But the empath, now awakened, will not return. This deepens the narcissist's sense of abandonment. Though they created the conditions for the empath to leave, their inner world becomes a place they can no longer escape. The emptiness they carried all along now feels like a crushing burden. And when they sit alone with their own mind, stripped of illusions, deprived of supply, they finally experience the first true taste of karma, the emotional consequences of avoiding responsibility, authenticity, and self-awareness. There comes a moment when the illusions the narcissist built with confidence begin to crack under the pressure of reality. For years, they manipulated perception, distorted truth, and created narratives where they were always righteous, always superior. They wore masks polished so convincingly that even they believed in them. But masks are fragile. When the empath steps away, the entire structure crumbles faster than expected. Their illusions were never built on solid ground. They were built on the emotional labor of others, on borrowed confidence, on the empath's ability to interpret abuse as compassion. The empath became the mirror that made the narcissist feel whole. When the empath breaks free, the narcissist loses that reflection. Without it, the mask collapses. They attempt to restore their illusions by seeking new supply, hoping someone will reinforce their grandiosity and absorb their projections. But new supply lacks the empath's depth, patience, and intuitive understanding. The narcissist finds the new reflection distorted and incomplete. They feel misunderstood, exposed, unsettled. Their mask becomes harder to maintain. Cracks appear: irritability, confusion, unexpected self-doubt. These cracks widen because the empath's departure removed the emotional glue. The narcissist attempts exaggerated charm or fake confidence, but these tactics grow weaker, manipulation becomes obvious, lies become transparent, their control weakens. Reality begins to push back. This is the collapse of their illusions, a deeply unsettling experience. The narcissist spent their life avoiding vulnerability through the illusion of superiority, but reality always catches up. Without the empath, reality enters without restraint. The narcissist feels people seeing through them. Their tactics lose power. Their grip slips, not only on others, but on themselves. Their emotional world becomes a battlefield where the false self clashes with buried insecurities. They no longer have the empath to stabilize their chaos. They are left alone with the truth of their identity, and that truth terrifies them. Without validation, without control, without admiration, they feel empty and insignificant.